baby Isaac was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer and needed surgery for a tumor that took up half his abdomen. His odds were the flip of a coin. But at Seattle Children's, he had one of the most experienced pediatric cancer surgical teams in the nation, and they brought him back to 100% himself. Maybe 200%.
For kids with the most complex surgical cases, it's not about beating the odds, it's about changing them. Find your hope at seattlechildrens.org.
Did our consultation with Seattle Nanny, and then we hired the first one that we met. So that wasn't my intent by any means, but we were just really impressed with her. I think I did meet with one after her just because I was like, let's make Seattle Nanny do their job.
For sure.
But yeah, and then Isabel was interviewing other places and we didn't want to let her go. So it wasn't a long process for us.
Anyway, thank you for joining us today for the ParentEd Talk, Why Tenacity Matters in Raising Successful Kids with Tenacity and Children co-authors, Sam Goldstein and Robert B. Brooks. This is unbelievably their 14th collaboration, 14th book that they've co-authored. My name is Elaine Sulkin, and I am the very proud publisher and CEO of ParentMap, and even more proud mom of 3 adult children, adult kids, forever your children, and a very proud Bobby to a 1 and a 3-year-old. For those of you that are not familiar with ParentMap, we are a content-rich resource devoted to assisting you on your parenting journey. Just like all of our media partners, Baton Rouge Parent, Chicago Parent, Metro Parent, New York Family, and NOLA Family, we are all about trying to provide great content to parents. We like to say from broccoli to popcorn, meaning broccoli is usually the education, health, wellness, and development content, to, we'll call it nutritional popcorn. It's all about the out and about fun adventures that we can provide. So before we begin, I want to cover a couple housekeeping issues. Today's webinar will be recorded and republished for educational and promotional usage, and everyone who registered will receive a link to that recording to watch at their convenience or rewatch. We also invite you to join us in the conversation by using the chat feature on your screen and asking questions, which we will submit to Bob and Sam throughout the conversation. And this is just a reminder that the speaker presentation is best viewed in gallery view. So you can change that setting by clicking on gallery view in the upper right corner of your screen. Again, it's really exciting for us to welcome our media partners around the country: New York Family, Metro Parent in Detroit, Chicago Parent, Baton Rouge Parents, and New Orleans NOLA Family. So Sam is board certified as a pediatric neuropsychologist and a fellow of the American Psychological Association and the National Academy of Neuropsychology. He's an adjunct assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Utah School of Medicine. With Dr. Brooks, he has co-edited and co-authored, as I mentioned, 14 books. Since 1980, he has served as clinical director of the Neurology, Learning, and Behavioral Center in Salt Lake City, Utah. Bob is a psychologist on the faculty of Harvard Medical School and former director of the Department of Psychology at McLean Hospital, a private psychiatric hospital in the Boston area. He has won numerous awards for his work, including most recently the Mental Health Humanitarian Award from William James College in Massachusetts for the contributions as a clinician, educator, and author. Bob has also served as a consultant for Sesame Street Parents Magazine. So at this time, I just want to welcome Sam and Bob and start with question number 1. You have written a great deal about the concept of resilience and raising resilient children. What led you to introduce the concept of tenacity, and how does it relate to resilience?
So, Bob, do you want me to field that question?
Definitely, Sam. I always like Sam to really introduce how the collaboration began, especially around this book. So go with it, Sam.
So that might be the only question you get to ask, because the response is typically an hour long. I'll make it as brief as I can. Bob and I came on different roads to an appreciation about 25 years ago that fixing what's wrong with children, whether it's emotional or behavioral or developmental, whatever their adversities are, fixing simply didn't work. It didn't work in terms of our experiences, and it didn't work scientifically in terms of looking at the forces that insulate and protect children facing adversity as they transition into adult life. So that's how we came together. And we came together under an umbrella of looking at what factors insulate and protect children at risk. And we discovered that the factors that insulate and protect children at risk actually protect all children, but the children at risk have less opportunity to acquire that knowledge or those strategies or that way of thinking and emotionally regulating themselves. And we really missed the boat that we were spending so much time focusing on what's wrong with children, when in fact those who had problems, the focus for them needed to be more so on what's right about them and not necessarily fixing what's wrong. So that's how we came together. We came together by looking at this research on resilience, which is a much maligned and misunderstood term. Estee Lauder has a makeup called resilience. Everybody uses the term. Unfortunately, Bob, the Boston Red Sox this time around were not sufficiently resilient to find their way into the World Series, right?
Did you have to mention that? I was feeling so good after that lovely introduction, but go ahead.
All right. Well, they had a good year.
Yeah,
but,
thank you.
But so what we realized was that the best predictors of what happens to all children is what's right about them, not what's wrong with them. And we decided to look at whether that was even more so true for children at risk. And in fact, in looking at the scientific literature, it was the case. And one of the things I'm most proud of that we've done, excuse me, is organize that literature into two major textbooks for other clinicians. And we're finishing a third one now, a third edition, which is usually unheard of for major textbooks to do third revisions. So that's how we came to it. And what we wrote for parents and scientifically was an examination of the factors within the child, within the family, within the school and extended community that increased good outcome, that increased better outcome despite adversity. And resilience is a process, not a product. It's a process by which you function adequately by calling upon resources within yourself, within the people around you, or within the community. So we did that for a number of years, wrote a number of science books and trade books, and then realized that some people know what to do but don't do what they know. Meaning, knowing what you need to do to be resilient is not the same as having the self-discipline or self-control to do it. And that's been a big area of my research on children with poor impulse control and what happens to their self-discipline. And so we added a component to this model of resilience is only as good as your self-discipline may be to apply it. So that was our second component. And then I sort of thought we were done, and I'll finish by saying we weren't done, because we realized that we were paying insufficient attention to the biology and the genetics. And while biology is not destiny, it very clearly affects probability of who we are and what we do. The genetics determines the playing field of our lives. Experience determines where we end up in those lives. Experience clearly trumps genetics for all but the most severe situations and conditions. And I convinced Bob that the way to go about looking at the genetics was to examine human instincts. And we can talk more about what we mean, but it's not a bird building a nest or a salmon swimming upstream. It's certain qualities of behavior that our children exhibit before we ever show them or teach them. Our children are not tabula rasas. They're not blank slates. And for thousands of generations of children, before there were schools, before there were other kinds of institutions, parents raised children not just based on their experience, but even more so based on the genetics the children brought, the instincts they brought. And we can talk about them. We picked 7 that we thought were critically important and 3 that we thought people need to understand because they cause adversity for us. But things like optimism and empathy and altruism and fairness and responsibility, qualities we have long thought parents have to teach children. But in our new book, we demonstrate for parents the scientific literature clearly indicates children do this before we ever think about teaching it to them. So that for us is this developmental triad, what we call the essential triad. And the last thing I'll say is resilience is a process. Self-discipline is a process. Tenacity is a term we chose to describe what falls under this umbrella. Tenacity in and of itself is not an instinct. Tenacity is the inner strength to keep moving forward. And I joke, but in all honesty, we picked that word. One, we thought it was a good description, but two, because there were no books with that title. And we started this movement in resilience, and now everybody uses the word. And sometimes we get credit. Most of the time, someone just published a business book using the exact title of one of our books.
Amazing. Let me ask you to kind of expand, maybe Bob, you will, on what the key elements are involved in tenacity.
Yeah, just to let you know, when Sam first approached me, and this is the wonderful part of anyone who collaborating with someone like Sam, because it's been such a worthwhile collaboration. My first concern was, is it really adding anything to our previous writings? And as we talked more and more, what was very exciting about this project was, as Sam articulated some of the instincts, some I was more familiar with, like optimism and intrinsic motivation, was very exciting as we talked more and more. And it was also an opportunity for us to review our own careers and where we came to this point, that in fact, the rudiments, and that's what we call it instincts, are there from birth. One of our book reviewers said, this is one of the most hopeful books I've read, because it's not like we have to somehow plant the seeds. The seeds are already there. So what they were is, some listeners will be very familiar with that, and we gave like descriptive words before: compassionate empathy. That from birth, kids are already showing the rudimentary signs of empathy and compassion. And intrinsic motivation, I'm looking at this, I don't miss any. Optimism, intuitive optimism. It allows kids right from birth to feel, even if you fall down, you could get up again. And it may seem very simple, but it's there. Sam may want to go into more a concept that he really talks a lot about: simultaneous intelligence. It's not based on IQ tests per se, but it's probably one of the most important things to help us adapt. And there's altruism here, and virtuous responsibility, and fairness. And I give an example how even as a young child, I have a twin brother, how my mother would pour water for both of us when we were like 4 years old, and we would already be looking at, did she pour the same amount of water for both of us? Now, as we look at these instincts, one of our arguments is these are there. So what we want parents to think about is, what are the things you can do as a parent to nurture these? How do you help a child who's even a month, 2 months, 3 months old already start to develop the sense of compassion, the sense of altruism? I think what was very exciting for me, Elaine, is as we were writing the book and I was looking at research, Sam certainly knew a lot about it. It was very exciting to see there's a whole body of research. They may not call it instincts, and they don't have the concept of tenacity, which shows that children have these intuitive ways of knowing and behaving, what we call instincts, that can be so nurtured and cultivated in a very positive way. And in our book, I don't want it to seem too theoretical, because I know Sam and I are talking in theory. In the book, we made sure, and all of our books for the lay public are this way, we made sure that we give many, many examples, actual dialogue, actual behaviors of what parents can say to kids or do with kids, so that they would develop. In the past, we talked about resilience and self-discipline, and now we're talking about these 7 instincts of tenacity. So it turned out to be really one of the most exciting books, I think, that collaborating with Sam, because it was such a new way of seeing things.
You know, I have to say to you both, you know, it's always a little bit challenging, because I've been in this business for a long time. And when you, in the less than the first 15 minutes, acknowledge a parent's opportunity to look at what's right and not what's wrong. And that mindset is so powerful. You've been friends and collaborators for 3 decades, and Tenacity in Children is your 14th book we've mentioned. Your first groundbreaking, Raising Resilient Children. Much of your evolving thinking has been informed by a strength-based versus a pathology-based approach to working with children and families that fosters resilience. Can you help set the table and define a resilient mindset? And can you explain the concept of islands of competence?
Sam, you want to start with the resilient mindset?
Sure. And islands of competence is Bob's term. So I'll let him explain that. Well, maybe we should define what is a mindset, right? And to do that, we go back another step and we have to ask, well, where is your mind? Because we know where the physical brain resides, but where does the mind reside? And why do we have a mind? And how come our heart doesn't have a mind or our liver doesn't have a mind? Of what purpose is this? And can you imagine 1 million or 2 million years ago, our earliest ancestors sitting around a cave, having just consumed whatever they've eaten and warm and safe, and you're the first person with a mind. And everyone else is sitting there thinking, well, it's nice, it's warm, we're happy. And you are thinking, what am I doing here? Why do I exist? What is my purpose? The mind is a fascinating phenomenon. This is a clinic that I've run for 41 years. And we see people, I see 400 or 500 children a year with brain injuries whose physical brains have been adversely impacted. But it's fascinating to watch how some of their minds are so resilient in terms of their recovery and others really struggle. So the mind follows no rules of the universe. There's no logic, there's no math, there's no formula, there's no algorithm. And we define mindset as perhaps a set of filters, or ways of thinking that you filter the world through to decide how you feel, what you think, and ultimately how you want to act and what you want to do. So in those first books, we talked about the child with a resilient mindset, meaning they saw mistakes as opportunities to learn. They saw the opportunity to help others as something that was valuable to do. These are ways of interpreting the world and acting in that world that connect you to others, that insulate you, that increase the likelihood that under challenge and adversity, you will continue to function and at the end, maybe even turn out for the better. And we wrote about the mindset of parents and teachers capable of instilling that mindset, which again runs parallel. So I don't know that we have an exhaustive list, but under that umbrella is ways of thinking about the world around you, ways of assigning feelings to those thoughts, and ultimately ways of taking those thoughts and those feelings and translating them into what we would call functional or adaptive behavior. And that's why that's so different from Tenacity, which again is about recognizing these instincts in children. Some find it easier to develop than others. And I see parents, or we see parents as engagement coaches. We see parents as creating experiences for children to develop these instincts. If we're talking about, responsibility, creating opportunities, even for young children to knock on a neighbor's door and ask, is there something I can do to help you? Right? It's nurturing that. And for some children, it's harder to develop because these instincts are polygenetic. It's not one gene that determines whether you're empathic or responsible. It's a lot of genes. And biology isn't destiny. It affects probability. So even if you have all the genes, if you don't have the experiences, sometimes the genes don't work or don't turn on. So that's what we mean by a mindset. And if I have to use the term for tenacity, then it's a mindset of parents who understand and appreciate how you help children engage with their environment in ways to build optimism, to build motivation, to build a sense of fairness or altruism, the willingness to help others. And just to add one more thing, as Bob pointed out, each one of these 7, we've added a modifier to: intuitive optimism, intrinsic motivation, compassionate empathy, partly because we think it better defines that action and behavior, but also because, quite honestly, it sets us apart from everyone else. When we talk about intuitive optimism, we're the only people that use that term for now, whereas a lot of people use the term optimism and intuition. So some of it is in this day and age is marketing strategy, right? It's placement so that people give you credit. Bob and I have both had others steal our words, not alone our ideas, and adopt them for their own. And I'll be honest, we're both New Yorkers. All I have is I have my intellectual property. So if you're going to use my terms, you don't have to pay me, but at least say, hey, that's Goldstein and Brooks' ideas. That's a pretty good idea.
Let me turn to a couple questions that are in the Q&A here.
Sure, but Bob should just.
I do want to get into
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay,
Go
can I
ahead.
just get into that? Because that was something I introduced and then Sam and I elaborate upon, but it represents really a foundation for part of the strength-based model. And I'll quickly say this because we do want to get to some of the questions, Elaine, but I think a big mistake I made as a beginning therapist is that I thought, and Sam and I talk about this in our book Tenacity, I thought that when parents came in to see me about their child who was having problems, or I went up to school to speak about a child with teachers who was having problems, that it was important for me to be able to make a list of all of the problems. It's like a deficit model. And I must say, I could spend the first couple of hours with parents and probably 98% was what's wrong with your kid, even though I was trying to be helpful, the same with teachers. And now this goes back almost 40 years. I found I was getting more depressed after these meetings, so I could only imagine what the parents and teachers were feeling. And at that point, I wondered what would happen if 15, 20 minutes into the first interview, I was to politely say, now that I've heard about a few of the difficulties your child or student is experiencing, what do you see as your child's strengths? And I just coined the term islands of competence. I had no idea what was going to happen. To make a long story short, I found people were more than willing to start looking at strengths. Not only that, in no way would Sam and I ever say, forget the problems, just tell us strengths. But it led people to be much more creative in their thinking about how to help a child, not just to see a child as a child with problems. And I said, this is really working much better. And little did I know, years later, there's going to be a whole body of research on positive emotions, which actually show when you create positive emotions in a situation, it actually helps activates, it seems, parts of the brain, and Sam is much more the brain person here, to be better problem solvers, to think of options more. So I guess at the time I was feeling good. I didn't know all that was going on in my brain, but it happened to be just a metaphor people liked. But for us, it really represented, we're going to start looking at strengths. And there are many examples of, what parents have told both of us, what teachers have told both of us. And it really represented, we may all have problems, but we all have, each of us, certain beauty and strengths. And then I often, and Sam and I would ask teachers and parents, what do they see as their own islands of competence? So we didn't ignore problems, but we wanted to bring up the beauty and strengths we all have.
And
So,
let me just add quickly, because Bob knows he has the experiential side and I add the science side. When you look at large scale studies of kids, because of our listeners today, there are a lot of parents with kids who are experiencing challenges. It often drives parents, not just parents of kids who are doing well, but parents of kids with struggles. So it's important for them to hear, when you look at large scale studies of kids who grow up with emotional or behavioral or academic problems, those who fare best in adulthood aren't those who had the most therapy, took the most medication, had the most IEP goals. No, it's those that have, as Bob points out, islands of competence. It's those that have strengths that they're able to fall back on to help balance their lives. So it isn't just a feel-good phenomena. It's scientifically accurate. When you look at the 1/3 of kids with ADHD or with learning disabilities or who grow up with anxiety, who as adults are doing reasonably well, which is about 1 out of 3 in those populations, it's not because they had more treatment. It's because someone helped them appreciate and make use of their assets in adult life.
Thank you, Sam. First of all, I want to acknowledge some people seem to be having issues with auditory and visual, and we will send out, this is live, we will send it out to everyone who's registered. So if you're unable to hear, you will get this, because your words are magnificent. Not that they're hearing what I'm saying. Anyway, next few set of questions. I want to, people are like craving practical advice, and for, of course, different ages and stages. Parents really suffer because they think, oh, my child's 14. How do I still do this? So can you give some examples of what parents and engagement coaches can do to help instill tenacity and resilience? Is there a point in time when it's too late? And can you also really address this from an educational mode?
Should I just jump in here, Sam?
You start, Bob, because this is a good entree in a practical way for me to talk about simultaneous intelligence, because that's a very practical set of suggestions.
Elaine, okay. Your question, first of all, was like 5 questions in there.
I know.
So let me get to one of the ones, is it ever too late? I always love this, Mike. Years ago, Freud said, I think by the time we're 5, our personalities are set. And I learned about this when I was 16 or 17, so I was very upset. So this is, after writing a couple of books, I'll say it this way. After writing a couple of books about resilience in children, Sam and I wrote a book about resilience in adults through our senior years. And it was our way of saying it, that one could, even though certain things may seem more fixed, I have to believe it's never too late, else we would not have written a book about that. Just like in tenacity, those instincts are there at birth, but it doesn't mean they stop growing, when you're 20 or 21. And I've seen wonderful examples of kids at different ages, even those with challenges, and Sam and I have so many, when we presented together, so many wonderful examples of kids who can really start to thrive. So I'll say it's never too late. And I want to throw in something here, which is very important, which I don't want to miss. If you look at the research on resilience, one of the main findings in terms of helping kids develop a resilient mindset is, and there's a lot of research on this, I won't bore people with, is that, and Sam alluded to this, there is at least one person, hopefully a number of people, who are, as Julius Siegel, the late psychologist Julius Siegel, called a charismatic adult, an adult from whom a child or adolescent gathers strength. And the reason I bring this up is, if a parent feels at 12 or 13 it's too late, they're not going to be able to serve in that way. It's a basic concept we use in our work, that those parents who help to nurture resilience and self-discipline and now tenacity can serve as a source of strength for their kids. Now, the issue here that you brought up is, at different ages, it's different. But let me just take one quality in terms of a couple very quickly, because we could both go into this so much. If what we propose are basically guidelines or strategies, what you would use with a 5-year-old would be different than a 10 or 15 or 20-year-old. So even with islands of competence, you could look at, okay, what's an island of competence for a 5-year-old? Or a specific 5-year-old, or a 10-year-old, or 15-year-old. But another key dimension, which is captured in tenacity, but we also highlight in resilience, is one of the things we know that helps people to be resilient at any age throughout the lifespan is if they are engaged in activities where they feel they are making a positive difference in the life of someone else. And that doesn't mean just doing volunteer work. When you're 4 or 5, a parent saying, I need your help. There's research to show kids are less likely to drop out of school, because you mentioned school, less likely to drop out of school in high school, these very at-risk kids, if they are given an opportunity to read to younger kids in elementary school. So you tailor make it. In our clinical practices, we're not going to say this is the only way the only strategy way to really realize the strategy. We're going to want to know more about that child, what the child's interests are, what the child's passions are. And that's why it's important to start asking parents, when have you noticed that your child is excited? I've had parents say, my child's never motivated. Have you ever seen your child being more motivated? When? And you try to look at those opportunities when kids are showing certain behavior. So I know I touched on several different things. I would never be a therapist if I felt it's just too late. Some families and kids, it's more difficult to assist given all the challenge they face. But I do feel that it's important at any age to be that charismatic adult in the life of our kids. And in our book, The Power of Resilience, about resilience in adults, we give examples of adults with our adult children there. And so, Sam, I know I went through several things, and I know Sam loves to talk about the simultaneous intelligence in terms of what we could do to help kids.
Let me start by saying that most parents are good enough for most children, even though they don't always think so.
Mm-hmm.
And even for children that struggle, we've created a world in which parents now wonder if they're smart enough, if they're capable enough, if they know enough to teach or mentor or support their children across all kinds of activities, not just school or sports. And the questions you're fielding really reflect that sense of, tell me how to do it. Tell me the 7 steps I need to do, as if there's only one right way. And one of the reasons we've moved away from a pathology view is that we've assumed that if a child has a problem, then they're in the matrix, they're a Stepford wife, and their diagnosis leads to one set of solutions, and we tend to ignore the qualities they share with all other kids and the qualities that are unique to them. And those 2 sets of qualities are much better predictors of what happens to them in life. So first thing I tell parents is take a deep breath. And don't be so concerned that there's only one right way. Kids are pretty resilient, meaning you can screw up a lot and they forgive you. Bob and I use the term helicopter parents, not the way a lot of people use, meaning you hover over your child, but to get up above and realize childhood is many, many years and thousands of experiences, and no single one in and of itself is going to be the end all or be all determinant. So that's my first response when people say, tell us the 10 things we should do or the 7 things we should do. Now, the one I want to talk about, as Bob mentioned just briefly, is simultaneous intelligence, because I think it's probably the most exciting thing happening in child development.
And I just want to add, I'm sorry, Sam, because some people may have joined a little late or not heard. That is one of the 7 instincts, in case people came in late. Okay,
right.
Sorry.
And what I was going to say was that each of the chapters in the book defines what these are, reviews the research so that you should believe us, because wrong information is worse than no information, to convince you we're not just making it up, and then offer you a set of guideposts, whether your child's 5 or 15, to take this into practice, how to use it, whether it's empathy or fairness or whatever it may be. And before we end, there's 3 instincts we want to talk about that we think parents need to be aware of that work against us, that are also instincts. And if we're not careful, we inadvertently nurture those, but they lead children to problems. But let me tell you about simultaneous intelligence, because for thousands of years, intelligence was defined as how well you solved a problem, not how many years you went to school. And the well-meant efforts of our educational system have defined gifted and intelligence not by how well you solve problems, but by how well you read, how well you perform math, how well you write. Sure, intelligence is a variable, but I have some very bright kids I work with who are average readers, and they will not receive gifted education in the schools. And by the school's definition of gifted intelligence, before the year 1800, there were no smart people. Nobody went to school. Nobody could read. Well, this is ridiculous. So the term we use, simultaneous, is a term coined by the late Russian neuropsychologist A.R. Luria, and I'll explain it. And what we're looking at is runs diametrically opposed to the historical view that intelligence is set in stone. Your kid's not very smart, tough luck. We know better now. It's not set in stone when you define it as a way of thinking and a way of problem solving. So the term we use is simultaneous intelligence, and I'll give your listeners 2 examples so they can identify what we're talking about and tell them how to go about helping their kids do it at any age. So simultaneous means seeing how all the pieces fit together at the same time. If I say 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, the only piece of information you need to predict 12 is 10. It's a predictable sequence. If I say 1, 3, 6, 10, 15, and I won't put you on the spot, but if 1, 3, 6, 10, 15, in order to appreciate the next number is 21, you have to simultaneously see how every number is related to every other number. If I take one number out of the pattern, you can't figure it out. So if I give you 10 facts about an animal and you randomly pick 3, you may choose an animal that matches the 3, doesn't match the remaining 7. Good simultaneous thinkers leave no piece of information inside the box unconsidered. One of my favorite experiences, I just had it this morning. I was testing a 4-year-old with some significant developmental problems, and he's putting puzzle pieces together, Bob, from the younger Wexler, and his dog. And he puts the pieces together, and he has an extra piece, the mid part of the dog, but he puts it together without it. And he holds up the piece and he goes, "There's an extra piece." He doesn't think simultaneously. That's at his age, he has yet to learn how to do that, right? And creativity is thinking outside the box. Creativity is taking a piece of information that other people aren't considering and putting it in the box with all the other information everybody else has and coming up with something new. That's what simultaneous intelligence is. That's what critical thinking is. And in the book, we go through the research that has demonstrated you teach kids how to do this by practice, by example, and it generalizes. I mean, a big challenge for us in education isn't teaching children something. It's teaching it to them in a way that they can take it and use it in other places, in other circumstances, in other ways. Teaching you how to study for a social studies test should also teach you how to study for any test. That's the goal, right? So what we've demonstrated and what others have demonstrated is you teach kids to do this. Their grades go up, which is parents are concerned about that. Their problem solving goes up. They make better decisions in their lives by teaching them how to do this. So what do you look for? Well, you get on the web and you look for sites teaching kids critical thinking, teaching kids how to solve problems. You play 20 questions with kids. I'm thinking of something in this room. And by experience, they learn how to very succinctly narrow down the subject matter they're asking about. Or you give them puzzles. You know, a man goes in an elevator and he gets out and he walks up 10 floors to his apartment. Why does he do that? And the kid has to figure it out. Not by guessing, but by asking deductive or inductive questions to come to a solution. And kids learn how to do it no matter what age, at their level, and no matter what ability. I'm sometimes astounded that some of the kids I see with, quote, above average IQs don't know how to think critically. They know vocabulary, they know information, they can put puzzles together, but when it comes to solving a real problem, they don't know how to do it. It's something you have to learn by experience how to do. Your genes may give you the opportunity to do it maybe a little quicker or a little slower than other people. But without experience, it doesn't develop.
So people are really wanting to hear the bad instincts, and I'm hoping you can weave part of that into a question around, do you think that tenacity looks different in different genders?
I'll let Bob feel that.
The reality is, it's very interesting. In all of the books Sam and I have written, but you could correct me, Sam, we have not really gotten into, in the textbook, we've had people who are very well versed in terms of, you know, boys and girls write separate chapters. But I'm thinking in our books, we give guidelines, and I don't know how this is going to sound, that we think you have to know every child and you have to know the differences in terms of gender. But I don't think we have like any separate chapters. This is how you raise resilient girls, or this is how you raise resilient boys. Because with all the kids we've seen in therapy, I'm sticking to that population, I have to know each individual child. but the guiding principles will be the same. How they are applied with any particular child may differ. So in our textbooks, we had people write specifically about development in girls and development in boys as it relates to resilience. But I don't think in our books like Raising Resilient Children or The Power of Resilience, about resilience in adults, or in Tenacity, we distinguish, because we say this is for every child. Know your child, and certainly gender would be brought into something like this, just as anything that may distinguish people from each other. So probably a fairly vague answer in that regard.
Let me be more specific.
Okay.
I'll be more specific.
And get to the 3 bad instincts, because
we'll come to the 3 bad ones, but let me be more, because I think there are 2 ways of looking at this. There are gender issues that are inherent in the evolutionary development of our species, and earliest species on this planet reproduce by copying themselves. Mayflies copy themselves till the last mating of the season, and they go look for a mate, hoping to get some genes to keep their larvae alive through the winter. And girls were here before boys. I know what the Bible says, but the Bible is written by men. Females were here first and created a second gender to carry genes. That's the role of the male, is to carry extra genes. But that's a whole other topic. Put that aside for the moment. So are there some gender-based issues here, genetic issues? Yes. Guess what? Girls are smarter than boys at every single age. When we measure their simultaneous intelligence, their ability to think critically at every age, and I have the research, I've done the research to show it in one of our big studies, girls are, I use a statistical term, 1/3 to 2/3 of a standard deviation, meaning pretty significantly better at every age in critical thinking. And the only reason girls don't run the world is males developed aggression as a means of fighting amongst themselves to get females, and then turn that aggression on the females. And I joke sometimes that it's women's fault that the world is screwed up because we were aggressive because you guys were not so nice to us. It's a silly concept, but the fact of the matter is there are gender-based differences. I'm not going to argue about optimism or empathy or responsibility, because there's not that, I don't know that literature. I don't think there is a literature. But in terms of critical thinking and problem solving, girls are clearly better at every age than boys. We talk about them maturing earlier. And boys clearly have a whole lot more trouble learning to sit still. And boys are clearly more prone to an aggressive response to any provocation than girls are. Now, the second side of that is cultural. And that's why we have chapters in our textbooks, not because we think so much that it's a genetics or evolutionary thing, but because the culture and society teaches girls from very early age, or teaches boys from very early age, to value certain kinds of behavior, to devalue other kinds of behavior, to emphasize or focus on other phenomena. And that influences how you cope with stress and adversity. Look what's going on now with social media, and the concern that some social media platforms allow material that is particularly harmful to girls. You notice the discussion here in the media is not about boys, it's about girls. But somehow the culture pushes girls have to look a certain way, have to behave a certain way. So yeah, I do think that there are probably differences as parents that we want to emphasize. I don't think we want androgynous children. I think we have to accept the differences, and we have to find ways to guide our children through it.
Could I know you wanted Sam to get to the 3. Okay, just one point I want to build on what Sam said for the listeners to hear. When he talks about simultaneous intelligence and critical thinking, why this is also important. I've often said resilient children and adults see problems as things to be solved rather than overwhelmed by. Now, if you want to develop that, think of it this way. If you face a problem and your first thought is, I don't even know where to start, that's what leads to greater anxiety. That would lead to greater depression. But what Sam and I have argued for, and it's one of the characteristics of a resilient mindset and certainly in tenacity, is we want to develop in a child the sense that if there is a problem, there are ways of solving it. With a young child that's even approaching an adult to have some help, One of the most scary feelings for many people is when they don't even know where to start, feel overwhelmed, and they feel every problem is like a rock around their neck, which weighs them down. So I just wanted to bring it in because it's a major characteristic of resilience. And now I'll let Sam talk about his, as he called it, his unholy trinity. We have an article in our website about the unholy.
About it.
Yeah.
But let me also point out that, again, the blend of what Bob and I have done, the experiential versus the science. So guess what? People who have trouble with planning, which is defined as organizing, strategizing, knowing where you are, knowing where you want to go in a problem, seeing the steps to do it. We can measure that neuropsychologically. One of my tests has a series of tests that measures that in children, that people with planning have a much higher incidence of worry. You know, worry is a lack of confidence in predicting outcome. At the extreme, we call it anxiety. So what Bob points out is fascinating, that not only can your experiences lead you to feel helpless in a particular circumstance or situation, but that your pattern of neuropsychological strengths and weaknesses, your abilities, as it were, and we talk about this in the book, the difference between ability, which is biologically driven. I'm not a biological determinist, but it does affect probability. Some people are better than others. Knowledge, which is what you learn, and skill, which is a verb, how skillfully you apply what you know, is how we kind of look at people. So there is an interaction of certain neuropsychological strengths that insulate you in problem situations or that create vulnerability. And I do think that of all our works, this one is the most biopsychosocial, meaning it appreciates there's a biological basis to who we are. We don't close our eyes to that. There's a social basis, our experiences, and there's a psychological basis, how we interpret what happens to us and how our biology affects that interpretation. So and I'm very proud of that. Let me quickly do this unholy trinity thing. And I will tell you, Bob laughs because we've tried to pitch books over the years. My favorite was How to Raise a Complete Idiot. And it was a tongue-in-cheek book on what not to do. But our agent said, no, you can't do that. And I started out wanting to write a book about.
By the way, do you see why it's so much fun to work with him?
I wanted to write a book, The Unholy Trinity of Child Development, of raising children. And again, we were told no. So in the last chapter in the book, and I just want your listeners to let go of everything they think they know, and I can do this in just 2 or 3 minutes. What I'm going to argue is that there are 3 instincts. An instinct is a behavior you exhibit in the presence of some stimulus in the environment, like you need my help, so I'm altruistic, I take my time to help you. That helped us survive, and our ancestors, humans, have been on the earth beginning with our earliest ancestors in Africa about 2 million years ago. Homo sapiens are a few 100,000 years, but earliest humans are about 2.5 million years. And these instincts helped us survive. But today in our society, if left unchecked or reinforced, they work against us. And the first one is belief. Belief is a valuable ally in the absence of fact. There's so many things in the world people didn't understand for hundreds of thousands of years. You had to believe that it got dark, it would get light again. It got cold, it would get warm again. There wouldn't be water, but someday there would be water again. And so we as a species have a strong influence in belief. And I'm not arguing against it. I'm pointing out that when it's left unchecked, look at the problems in the world today when people use their beliefs politically, religiously, geopolitically, to foster their opinions and ideas in a violent way on others. So that's 1, belief. 2, fear of difference. We are afraid of difference because for thousands of years, you didn't visit the people on the other side of the valley because they would eat you. And you ate the same foods. You didn't eat anything else because you might get sick. You drank from the same water source. And this idea that every fear or difference between our different cultures or our different ethnicities is only cultural. I agree, culture plays a gigantic role. But the question I ask is, what is the foundation underneath that? And we have to confront that. We have to confront that as a species, when something is different, skin color, behavior, whatever it is, it makes us a little uncomfortable. But it doesn't have to lead to discrimination. It doesn't have to lead to violence. It can just as easily lead to saying it's a big, beautiful world and we're going to accept everybody in it. But you can see, if left unchecked, what fear of difference does. And the last one is an aggressive response to any perceived or real threat. And I borrow a term used by a colleague called brain dancing. And by brain dancing, I mean that at any given moment, any of us can lose control. And if there's enough stress, the front of the brain says, logic and reason out the window. And the middle of the brain says, we're going to deal with this emotionally. Because, again, for hundreds of thousands of years, if you had something that I wanted, I hit you over the head with a stick and I took it. There was no consequence. And I will ask listeners to consider that belief running amok, a fear of difference allowed to fester, and an aggressive response to any problem you experience in combination, I see it as responsible for everything that's going wrong in the world. I'm not trying to oversimplify it. And you will see children exhibit those patterns of behavior pushed by instinct. And when you're raised in a family that teaches you that certain people's skin colors are bad, that reinforces that fear of difference. And when you're raised in a family that says, no, skin color is not relevant, it's an idiosyncrasy of where of the diaspora of the human species. Out of Africa, it means nothing. Then children learn that, right? So that's my little spiel on belief, fear of difference, and an aggressive response to any perceived threat. And I don't think we're going to beat it out of our children, another aggressive behavior. I don't think we're going to yell it out of our children, or I just think we have to recognize that when a child responds aggressively or seems to have a belief that's not functional or is afraid of trying something new, it's our job, just like with the 7 affirmative instincts, to create experiences to help them understand that those instincts are not going to help you. They're not good for you. And the solution is reinforce and develop the positive 7. And the other 3 won't be a problem for your children or for you. I'm very passionate about this, as you can tell.
So I know I speak for the hundreds of other people listening that we could spend hours with you guys. I'm going to throw out a last question. And I feel like we've had so many insanely wonderful speakers, and you guys have been so terrific. So why do you consider intuitive optimism to be arguably the most important of the 7 instincts when it comes to developing self-discipline and a resilient mindset?
Well,
go ahead, Bob.
Well, from my vantage point is that in the absence of optimism, you are not going to attempt almost any change or do anything else. If you feel that things cannot get better, it was interesting. The intruding thought I had was Martin Seligman were very well known by talking about or research learned helplessness. But he had this epiphany along the way that maybe if, there's really helplessness, he started to write about learned optimism and the optimistic child. So from our vantage point, it's not that one instinct is, more prominent, but it seems like such a foundation, because if you get up every morning and say, the world is lousy and nothing is going to change, why try to change anything? So what you want is for a child, at least if we're talking about raising a kid, to feel that change can take place. And that's why I picked up on Sam's notion of simultaneous intelligence. You can feel that things could get better if there are solutions to problems. See, they all tie together. But I will tell you, if you're very pessimistic, you are not going to have the courage to start to change your behaviors. And I don't want to overly simplify it, because I believe in all 7 of these instincts as being powerful. But optimism plays a very special role, I think, in both of our hearts and soul and in our books.
Yeah, let me just add one thing quickly, because I think for me it's optimism and motivation. Mm-hmm. Young children are instinctually optimistic. They have to be. How many times do they get up and fall down before they can walk or talk or do? You have to have not a conscious belief, but a drive. So the default position for us, and that's what Seligman figured out, maybe from reading our stuff, but that's what he figured out, is that the default position isn't learned helplessness. The default position is optimism, and not even learned optimism. It's optimism that's then reinforced. And the other side of that is motivation. You don't have to pay a 2-year-old to do anything. They just want to help. And young children go off to school and they are intuitively optimistic, and they are intrinsically motivated. And for most of them, their school experiences reinforce that. But when they struggle, the fire goes out. And when you ask second graders in a special ed classroom, do you think you'll be able to learn those words? They say no. And when the resource or the special ed teacher works with them, she doesn't say the reward you'll experience for learning the spelling words is feeling good inside. No, she says you can take something out of the grab bag. She externalizes their motivation. So for me, it's the two in combination. And by second and third grade, children who struggle in school, the fire is out. And as Bob and I have learned, until you find a way to start the fire, no matter what kinds of programs or medicines you throw at them, nothing really changes.
Yeah, and Robert White, a psychologist at Harvard many years ago, said that within every child from birth, there is an inborn need to really master your environment, which really has to do with intrinsic motivation, as Sam mentioned. And too often we turn intrinsic motivation into extrinsic motivation rather than looking. This is where, and I'll just end with it because I see the time. This is where things like islands of competence and what we call contributory activities come in. You get the enjoyment, the motivation out of engagement in activities where, one, you feel you can start to master, and two, bring you a certain sense of joy and passion. And again, we bring in a lot of theory, but I can guarantee we give a lot of very specific examples, as we've done all of our books, actual dialogues of what teachers can say, parents can say, to really realize how to nurture these 7 instincts in different settings.
And for parents to appreciate that we're not arguing against reward. We're not arguing against positive reinforcement. We're not arguing against punishment when children can shift their behavior. We're pointing out that it always has to be paired with that mindset. Mm-hmm. That why did you earn that reward? Well, because I did that job. No, you earned that reward because you made a choice that that's what you wanted to do. The reward wasn't for doing the job. The reward was for making a commitment. And that's the internal. You always have to reinforce the internal. Otherwise, you get kids who by college want to know whether you're going to buy them a Corvette to go to class.
Bob and Sam, I cannot thank you enough. I learned so much, as I know everyone has. And thank you for bringing why tenacity matters in raising successful kids to life. I look forward to digging deep. And again, I want to thank our media partners. It's such a joy to have Chicago Parent, Metro Parent, Baton Rouge Parent, New York Family, and NOLA Family joining us so that we are spreading more of the great wisdom, science, and advice that you have, because we all want the same thing for our kids. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And there's more on our websites, both Bob's name and my name. There's all kinds of articles for parents. We both send out free articles if parents are interested. And then there is a Tenacity site, as you put up earlier, just tenacity.com.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.